Collins. Welcome to Writers Read. This program is brought to you as a public service presentation of WPRG TV5, Harold, Kentucky. Today we're at the York Mansion in Pikeville, and once again we have as our special guest Mr. Gayle Compton. Gayle, welcome again to the show.
Thank you. Good to be back again.
And what are you going to do for us today?
Okay, last week we discussed some of the etymology of my characters, and of course they're from Pembroke, Kentucky, which is Joe Nancy. The last piece that I did was more introductory. It was not literary. Occasionally, I like to let people out there know that I do some serious stuff. I've also done a lot of poetry, which I don't have time to read. I will not be able to read the entire piece that was published in Choir magazine, of which I'm associate editor, but I'll read enough of this so you can get an idea. There's some humor, some satire again, but this is one of the pieces that I intend to use in my anthology of Appalachian stories that I'm putting together. And I was asked earlier if I had a title. I don't have a title for the collection. I do have a title for this piece, which is Puny. It's entitled Puny. Puny Blankenship was going on 18 when I sat across from him in Miss Watson's 5th grade class. A full 6 feet tall, he sprawled like Gulliver among the Lilliputians in the back of the room in a seat he had occupied and guarded for 4 years, threatening and snarling at anyone who came near it, much less dared to sit in it. It was a seat rightfully belonging to him, a seat into which he had laboriously carved his initials with a big bowie he carried openly, and with which he etched grossly misspelled obscenities, Nazi signs, skull and crossbones, and the name of the girlfriend had long since passed him by, matriculating into the ranks of high school and college. Puny lived in Kettle Camp, that poor and vicious neighborhood below Pembroke, whose population, known as swamp rats, were dispersed in a scattering of dilapidated shacks that leaned tiredly on the hillside and along the creek bank and railroad track. The poverty, uncertainty, and general adversity that distinguished Kettle Camp were part of Puny's own rugged countenance. His face was not of callow youth, but one that was weathered and aged beyond his years. Puny's ample nose had been broken at least twice and was tilted in a singularly arrogant attitude. His great dirty ears stood out, each pitched at different angles. An Adam's apple the size of a walnut stuck out from his chicken neck and bobbed up and down when he swallowed or got in a big way of talking. A crop of stiff, lusterless brown hair came down over his eyes, about his ears, down his collar, and somewhere joined the tangled vineyard that was his sideburn and beard. The gray, deep-set eyes that generally gave him a hungry and haunting aspect often shone with a mischievous intensity. Puny had a tongue, which is also a curiosity. He could run it out like a garter snake about a foot or more and go to licking his chin and his nose and his eyebrows like a dog. Sometimes we would have to beg him to do it. Everybody would crowd around with their mouths open, ribbing one another and saying things like, "Lordy mercy, God, what a tongue. Did you see that? Wish I could do that." Man, if old Bernie was here now, then he'd see. Bernie was a boy who had moved in from Columbus and had gone to our school. He talked like a sissy, and we hated his guts. The only thing he had going for him was a glass eye, which he could roll around in its socket, tilt backwards and sideways, and turn around till just the white showed like a bird egg. And for a nickel he could be persuaded to take it out and let us take turns holding it. But that glass eye was nothing alongside of Puny Blankenship's tongue. He was a man without rival as far as tongues go. "Wrap it around your ear, stick it down your shirt collar," we'd say, and afterwards he'd roll it back in like a party favor and then laugh and show his rotten teeth just as pleased with the performance as we were, knowing in his heart that not a single one of us there would not have sold his very soul to have had such a tongue. Puny appeared to wear the same clothes every day of his life. With the exception of what people gave him, his entire wardrobe came from the missionary rag shaking that was held 3 or 4 times each summer in front of the post office at Pembroke. They were clothes that someone else had gotten the best of years ago in another climate somewhere. They were army surplus and factory rejects, shirts that had one long sleeve and one short sleeve or half a collar, pants that had one leg or both sewed up the cuffs so that one would have to have been an amputee to get any service from them. His shoes were men's work shoes, stiff, hard-toed brogans, with the steel peeping through the leather, and the toes turned up like sled runners. They were clothes that had seen heartache and death, war and famine, and they'd been handed down to Puny to wear to school. The nickname Puny, Charles was his real name, but you better not call him that. was suggestive of his gaunt physique only, and in no way indicative of his health. A boy who shed his shoes and shirt in middle March and did not don them again until late October, who owned neither hat nor coat, who frequently broke ice at the Pine Hole in January when in swimming, and never so much as sneezed the year round, could not be said to be in questionable health. There was much about Puny Blankenship, physically and spiritually, that set him apart from the rest of us, endeared him to us, and became just cause for worship. Everything about him was exciting and free and of the world. Nor did he even walk like the rest of us, but went about with a slow, deliberate, and daring stealth, a swagger that combined and exemplified the demeanor and arrogance of the cowboy and the buccaneer. Puny was everything we were not. Wonderfully free and dirty, a latter-day Blackbeard, a 20th century Huck Finn. He smoked, chewed, drank, and had been in jail. He could curse and blackguard with admirable facility and fluency. Above all, he could take school or leave it, having long since passed that magic age of 16. Puny's attendance at Redtown's little brick school was just regular enough to keep his family's welfare check out of jeopardy. He didn't give a damn about building Susan, Perky, or Fuzzy, or Sputnik, or where Madagascar was on the map. He'd arrive about 15 minutes after the bell had rung, stand in the hall outside the door, loudly stomping, kicking, and knocking the mud from his brogans. All the while he could be heard muttering to himself about something or other that made him late. Then he would come swaggering in, unencumbered by books or other scholarly appurtenances, this prince of rags, in the midst of his geography lesson. All eyes would be upon him as he made his way to the back of the room, purposely tripping, stumbling, and bumping into seats and making as much racket as possible. Miss Watson had learned to pay him no mind, responding to the interruption with a tight-lipped and patient tolerance. With yardstick poised before the blackboard, she would stop lecturing and wait until he found his seat, collapsing as usual with a violence that sent books, papers, and assorted trash cascading to the floor. Puny was not taught like the rest of us. Miss Watson had him in the second reader. For 7 years he had struggled along, scratching his head and wrinkling his brow with the abstruse texts of Alice and Jerry. When Miss Watson called on him to read aloud, he would squirm, stroke his beard, and get a befuddled look on his face. Page 36, Charles. Numbers confused him even more. When Miss Watson walked back and stood looking at him over her glasses, he became more uncomfortable and miserable than ever. There, that's it. Very good. Now read to us, Charles. Read to the class about Mr. Carl and the birds. Puny Blankenship was the one who taught me everything I know about the airworthiness of cardboard wings and patiently instructed me in handling some of the whims and liabilities of the umbrella as a parachute. He said I didn't know what fun it was until I'd ridden an umbrella off a barn roof. Again, we skip over part of the story to continue so we won't be so long. Continuing, Puny also was the one who told me that tying a bucket to a bull's tail was an exciting experience. Of course, I went straight and tried it, and found Puny's evaluation to be an honest one, though a bit understated. We were below the tunnel baiting our hooks during a history exam one pleasant afternoon when he explained the rudiments of a fishing method that he was acquainted with. It was one he guaranteed would get results. He said it took a blamed fool to sit on the creek bank all day long with a cane pole when he could be using dynamite. Dynamite? I asked a bit meekly, in a manner I hope would not reveal my ignorance on the subject and perhaps lead Puny to suspect that I had no prior experience with this method of angling. You have used dynamite before. He gave me a piercing look with his black eyes, then shook a live bait from the Prince Albert can. He slid a fat white grub onto the hook, plopped the line to the water, and anchored his willow pole with a forked stick. He dug deep inside his shirt pocket and retrieved a singularly short and flattened cigar. Oh, yeah, well, a couple of times, but it was a long time back, I said, and not very good dynamite. Well, I know where there's some good dynamite, and I reckon the mines wouldn't miss a stick or two. Now, how much should a man use, I mean, considering the weather and all? He put a paper match to the cigar and puffed hard, his cheeks sucking in and out. When the cigar took life finally, he leaned on one elbow in the sand and stared fixedly at a rusty, moss-infested oil drum. Now, I wouldn't start with less than 2 sticks, he said. The next day was Friday, and I decided to play hooky. I was down at the Pine Hole at daybreak with a biscuit and bologna sandwich, a fish stringer, and 4 sticks of TNT. After a few minutes of routine splicing, tying, and paying out fuse, I clamped the steel cap with my teeth, lit the yellow cord. Then I settled back under a sycamore to eat my biscuit and wait. What happened 3 minutes later convinces me, even now, that a mere 2 sticks of dynamite would have sufficed. I had just decided on a reappraisal of my shelter when I found myself in the eye of a hurricane, in the midst of a virtual earthquake, an avalanche, a volcano, a living Hiroshima of shuddering earth, great white livid pillars of rising rock, sand, and water shouting and writhing into the heavens. It must have rained rock, dirt, and tree limbs for 10 minutes. I decided to climb a sycamore nearby and did so quickly, not because I was scared, but because I wanted to get a better view of things. When the cloud lifted, I came down, deaf as a fence post and nearly as blind. Still, I was able to recognize an alarming change in the geography of the place. I stood on the shattered and smoking pine hole rock and pondered Puny's method of fishing. The plan had proved to be both productive and indiscriminate. It not only produced enough fish to feed the multitude, but laid by a good harvest of crawdads, mud turtles, and frogs. I suddenly remembered that I was needed at home on urgent business. I had forgotten to feed the chickens, a not so loathsome chore now, and I certainly didn't want to be late for school. In spite of the considerable differences in our ages, Puny Blankenship and I shared a young boy's fascination with trains. He introduced me to hoboing as a mode of travel and showed me how to gracefully swing aboard a co-drag that was doing 20 miles an hour without losing a leg. I also gained some knowledge of what happens when one drives a number of spikes between the rails and how to lie out of it afterwards. I was taught how to pull the air valves and release the brakes on a side track full of coal cars and set them loose and surprise people and cause no end of trouble and aggravation for the railroad company. But Puny was not with me the day I robbed the mail train. Now this was in early March, and I was spending the weekend in my Aunt Mag's in Flat Bottom, 10 miles downriver from Peabrook. I had always been fascinated by the old silver rattling one-coach mail train that came shuffling and screeching to a stop around noon each day at old man Sizemore's store. I was just as impressed by the manner in which the train dropped off and picked up its cargo. The method was a simple one, as I know now, but at the time I considered it a miracle. All outgoing mail was bagged in brown canvas and hung from a steel pole that stood by the tracks. When the mail coach approached this structure, an electric arm would swing out from the side of the train, snatching the bag away before you could say Jack Robinson, then reach out again, this time leaving a dangling canvas of incoming mail. I was agog. I wondered what would happen if a body climbed the pole and tinkered with the hook that held the bag. Would it fool the electric arm? Shortly before noon that Saturday, I hung around the store eating Gordon's potato chips and drinking RC colas until Jake Sizemore went out and hoisted his mail pouch. He was back inside and behind the counter slicing a pound of Kentucky Border for Grover meat when I shinnied up the pole. I slid the bag back a notch or two and came down quickly, but not a minute too soon. I could hear the rumble of the train and its whistle blasting its warning above the curb as I dived over the bank and into the safety of the tall weeds. I watched breathlessly as the train came into view, slowed, screeched, and spewed to a stop by the mail pole. The mechanical arm reached for the bag, but its steel fingers grabbed empty air. It seemed to hesitate as though confused, retracted, then swept forth again with a bulging canvas of incoming mail. But the receiving hook was gone, and the heavy bag dropped dully into the gravels. The train moved on, a blind robot with no conscience, hooting and grumbling around the curve and out of sight. I came out, seized once more by devilish curiosity. I took the fallen sack, lugged it into the bushes and over the bank. I turned the sack upside down and began sorting through the contents. I discovered nothing interesting or worthwhile. There were several Montgomery Ward catalogs and some magazines with some rather nice-looking women in them, but nothing arresting. There were some small parcels that produced little treasure, only several pairs of nylon stockings, a case of white cloverine brand salve, and a pair of women's drawers that you could have held a revival in. There were dozens of letters, and I read one or two, dull stuff that said stuff like, "Dear Sally, thought I would drop you a few lines to let you know," and so on. "How are you? Fine, I hope. How is Billy and little Catherine? Fine, I hope. Is George still in jail? Mommy got her prayer cloth from Brother Roberts, and her hemorrhoids are as bad as ever." And there was some other correspondence that was no benefit to me either, being merely a bundle of brown envelopes containing some 30 or 40 government checks, Social Security checks, as I was to find out later. So I took bag and all, dumped it into the river, and went away feeling pretty satisfied. I had fooled the electric arm, and I couldn't wait to tell Puny. We were up at the railroad tunnel having a smoke during the last recess when I told Puny what I'd done. You did what? Puny's face clouded up. He looked the same way he did the day the principal came and got him out of the school when his brother got killed in the mines. I robbed the mail train, I told him. Then I filled him in on how I'd done it. I waited for the accolade, but it didn't come. He just sat there, the cigarette nearly burning his fingers, staring at me and swallowing hard with his big Adam's apple bobbing up and down. You fool, he exploded. Don't you know that's a penitentiary fence? He stood up, waving his arms about and cursing me till I was ready to cry. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. He called me Captain, and I knew he was not really mad at me, but just concerned. Listen, Captain, no matter what happens to you, you didn't do it. You understand me? You didn't do it. Puny fished out another cigarette and lit it from the butt he was smoking. He kept talking and walking up and down. He spun on his heel and stared at me. His eyes were black and searching. You didn't go and tell anybody else about this, did you? No, just Freddie Fouts and little Jimmy Joe Lester. They thought you was in on it, but I told them it was all my fault. The two biggest mouths in town, why, it'll be all over school. You can bet on that. Once their maws get a hold of it, we're burnt. It'd be all over town. You better lie out of it, that's all. Just lie out of it and tell Freddie and Jimmy they better keep their sissy mouths out of it or you'll beat the... No, better you tell them I'll beat the daylights out of them. You tell them. And remember, Captain, you didn't do it. You understand? Anybody asks you about it, you don't know nothing. He kept shaking his head. A penitentiary fence, that's what it is. A genuine penitentiary fence. It was unusually cold for mid-April that Friday morning when Miss Watson's history class was interrupted by her principal, Mr. Moore, and another man. The latter was a tall man with big shoulders and an unfriendly red face. He stood behind Mr. Moore, staring stonily ahead, his hands jammed into the pockets of his expensive-looking gray suit. I remembered a banker who wore that same kind of suit, and his image was before me now, a moon-faced man who sat in a big leather chair and told my father he did not qualify for the loan. Miss Watson looked pale and embarrassed, called Puny's name and then mine, and asked us to come forward. They wanted us in the principal's office. I was frightened, afraid of the well-dressed, unsmiling stranger, yet beneath the fear there was a strange sensation of pride, because it was Puny and me they wanted, and all eyes were upon us. Puny, Blankenship, and me, criminal suspects, and wasn't that just the same thing as being an outlaw like Jesse James or John Dillinger? Maybe I would become famous like that guy Starkweather who had killed 8 people in 1 week and who was in all the newspapers, who went to the electric chair smiling like James Dean. I was surprised to find both of my parents seated in Mr. Moore's office. Dad was grim-faced and silent, Mother beside him, looking tired and older. She didn't look up when I entered the room, but sat staring into her lap, twisting her handkerchief into hard little knots. I don't remember all that transpired during the brief and inglorious half hour in Mr. Moore's office, and I responded to each question with a yes or no or nod of the head, hardly recognizing the question, but a voice seemed far away, a voice calling out of a fog. I became more aware of the surrealistic images that swam before me, the vase of red and yellow plastic flowers on Mr. Moore's desk, the pencil sharpener by the door, Mr. Lafferty, the 6th grade teacher, a balding young man with chalk dust on his sleeve, interrupting briefly with apologies, the staccato tapping of a typewriter across the hall, the asthmatic wheezing of the steam radiator under the high window with its lopsided Venetian blinds. Mr. Compton! It must have been the 3rd time. The voice was impatient and urgent. Young man, what can you tell us about? But suddenly it was Puny's voice I heard, not far away or out of a fog or a storm, but loud and angry. And he was standing up, facing Mr. Moore and the officer, declaring, literally threatening. I done it, he screamed, his voice shaking. I done it. I'm the one got the mail sack and I throwed it in the river. It was over. The big man with the banker's suit took Puny by the arm. As he was being led away, I was surprised at how small he looked in his old baggy pants and the faded red flannel shirt my mother had given him 2 winters ago. How hungry and hollow-eyed and scared. He turned and looked at me, the same crippled and disappointed look that he had given me in a railroad tunnel when I had told him about the mail train. But his eyes changed quickly and became the self-assured and mischievous eyes of one who had told me to tie a bucket to a bull's tail, to use dynamite. Be good, Captain, he said. It was the last time I'd ever see him.
Oh, that's sad.
There's more to the story, but it gets so sad I might cry.
Well, it's very good.
Based on a true experience. I know we're about out of time, but I appreciate been on your program.
Well, thank you. You're very good. And I want to thank you, Gayle Compton, for being with us again today. I want to thank Dr. Don for allowing us to come to you. Until next week, may God bless you.